my chiropractic appointment isn't until Tuesday. That makes it a little. There we go. Yeah, it's kind of been bouncing out. So, anyhow, well, welcome. As you recall, last week we were talking about Austin McGarry, and he was began the firm foundation in Texas. And we were kind of looking into his kind of background and lifestyle to realize the rough and tumble life on the frontier. And we saw, kind of in his own life before he came to Christ, but, he was a sheriff and transporting prisoners and running for office, and, guys running against him. He, meets them, and or a guy that was coming to organize people, and he meets them and sticks him up and has him drink castor oil and sends him on his way. And, just a very different, rough, tough, and tumble life in that whole environment. And then when he started the firm foundations, we saw he did it expressly to kind of give an alternative view to the Gospel Advocate coming out of Nashville. And so we're seeing that thinking generally kind of in that Tennessee area and all that was a little different than it was in Texas. And so, realizing that there is these differences. So we're looking at that to try to understand, why those things are so. And so to understand McGarry's caustic style, we have to take into account that he also identified completely with the common people, and that had little to do for fashionable society. And of course, what's fashionable society? Well, usually that's referring to, it was that social economic divide. And as you said, we kind of looked at that a little bit way back when we were looking at Alexander Campbell, or rather about Bethany. And we had some people go there, and they go, what's all these tea parties and that kind of stuff that's going on? And so it was just a culture shock. And so, and there was also the belief that this idea of having wealth and being a Christian in some minds didn't go together, because you don't read much about that. And so, there's a problem. And so there was this inherent, kind of bias, which we see and know about, because we see that. I remember I went to Parkway North. Well, Parkway North. I go, Parkway, well, that was a big expensive into schools, and it was. But Parkway North was the slum end of Parkways, as they used to say. And so within the school district, there was attitudes, against the West and the Central folk that were the real wealthy end of it, and us the North. And that social economic divide was, those attitudes were real on a low level, if you will, but nonetheless. And so we see that those things go in and influence how one looks at some of that. And so he believed that the fashionable classes had undonated the church in Austin. Of course, he was located in Austin, excluding and ignoring the common people, himself included. He had nothing but praise for Elijah Hansbrough, a Texas preacher and an agent for the Firm Foundation, who he said wields the old Jerusalem blade with telling effect. He complained that the majority of the brethren in the vicinity of Austin are too slack-twisted to appreciate Brother H's preaching. Now, that's a term we don't usually hear, slack-twisted. What does that mean? What do you think it means? Wimpy. They're just not tough enough. They're just a bunch of wimps. Suck it up. You got to be a little tougher. You're letting a few words bother you. That kind of thinking is kind of what was in the minds of many. McGarry's deep-seated lower-class bias played an enormous role in shaping the Firm Foundation, just like Benjamin Franklin's did with the American Christian Review, both in content and style. As far as McGarry was concerned, the greatest source of corruption in the church in the 1880s was the growing class of salaried preachers. Men McGarry regarded as raving wolves who cared only for money, fashion, and reputation. And so, whoa, what's going on here? Huh? I don't know. I don't know how they were paid. Maybe they gave him a few chickens and a pig or something. Who knows? Pardon? Well, that's what some would say. Or you had the love offering, or things like that. And so that idea of what they called non-located preachers, that was very prevalent in certain segments of our brotherhood. That's some of this, and there's thinking behind it. I mean, it's not that it's all nuts. And frankly, in today's times where it's so difficult to find preachers and associate preachers, because that's something that's really changed over the last 10, 20 years especially, that there are those that are going back to this kind of thinking, not necessarily with that attitude behind it, out of necessity. As Carl said years ago at Elders, the place he was at, wanted to give the preacher a raise, but most people were against that. And so we needed to keep our preachers in poverty to keep them honest, didn't we? It was kind of the thinking. Well, that's kind of what, Bill. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. 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 Sometimes it depends on how you define it. Yes. No. Sure. Oh, sure. Sure. And then then we see the things today where, hey, you need to give more so I can have my private jet to get around all the places to spread the gospel, and things. Obviously that's an extreme, the other direction, but sure. Hmm. Sure. Sure. And so Kim was saying that the role changes if you have someone that comes in, preaches for a little bit, and then goes on, and then the congregation, and that's very so. Probably the best of it is like both, as you're kind of saying, is and that's often one of the complaints against the located preacher is everybody else thinks, oh, that means I don't have to do anything. I'll just let the paid guy do it. I've heard expressed before, and so just again, it's different way of thinking. And as I look at it, it's not right or wrong necessarily, but it's different. But often, differences are looked at in terms of right and wrong, whatever that happens to be, however proper or improper that is. And so anyhow, so we see that playing out. Now, part of that divide is because you're in the rural areas, or you call Austin rural. Well, certainly not now. Maybe back then it was a little different. And the urban, suburban areas, very, very different mindset that is often there, and for reasons. You can't be a rural church in an urban mindset, per se. It just doesn't quite work that way. The thinking's different and all that, and probably vice versa. And so it's just important that we realize these differences, and that can be okay. And so we should realize that. If primitive Christianity was to be restored, the system of the modern pastor must be regulated to the bats and owls with all its worldly trumpetry. It was time, he wrote, to call in all the old pioneer preachers who have been pushed aside to give place to gay college striplings who have been taught preaching as a trade, and let these old soldiers recognize the churches after God's plan. Now, of course, using the word gay here is not as we would contemporarily think of it. Okay? That was, now if it was nowadays it might be, but that's okay. It's just, kind of like, hey, everything's good, is what, yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Long documented. You're right, and that's the problem. Yet in the minds, what's happened, and we've all thought this way to some degree or another, to some issue, and we could look back and think in our own minds, depending on what it is. Might not be the same one, but that kind of thinking. And so it's really important to realize that. And so but the problems here is, hey, these guys are preaching pretty wimpy, and so we need where's the old tough guys who are maybe a little crude in the pulpit and things like that because they come from the rough and tumble, and so like any major changes that go on in life and culture, usually we resist that because we don't want that. And so that visceral response is usually the first thing we do, instead of maybe asking why or looking at it deeper or thinking like that, because that's what we do as people. That's how we often react. When McGarry sought to justify his combative style, he pointed first of all to the growing class of wealthy and fashionable Christians, social economic divide here, not spiritual, but then equating the two, who are for peace, peace, peace. Such people, he charged, would readily make peace with the organ, the grab bag, the church sociable, jug breaking, I'm not sure what that is, parlor dancing, modern pastor who lords it over the heritage, immodest apparel, such as jewelry, bangs, oh my goodness, frizzies, silks, I'm not sure the frizzy, I guess that's a perm. Did they have perms back then? I don't know. Silks, satins, etc., jockey caps and fine hats with tropical birds roosting in them. He's talking about the ladies with the big hats and the feathers coming out. And the missionary society and sectarian immersion. Faced with these sorts of serious threats, his conception of primitive Christianity, McGarry regarded the hard style as altogether necessary and appropriate. And so all these things that have nothing to do with the gospel or Jesus, look at the list. And so what is it? Now, these feelings are very real. And it's not saying that and they don't feel them and, things like that. But, wow. And so when we were early in January, when we were looking at fundamentalism and, spending some time on that, that's part of this is. Part of what this is battle against what was called modernism, where we're going from this rural agrarian society and then, wealth and stuff, people moving to the cities, all this works into that in some ways in various amounts. Among the economically deprived members of the Church of Christ throughout Texas and surrounding regions are people living on the margins of a rough and frontier society. The hard style became standard fare near the turn of the century. And when a congregation in neighboring New Mexico appealed for a preacher in 1890, it warned one of those soft-going milk and cider, one by one preachers need not apply. Soft teachers will not likely accomplish much in this territory. So 30 years later, J.D. Tant, a crusty Texas preacher, felt compelled to defend his plain Texas language to his Tennessee critics. It is true that my language is blunt and plain, but having been reared in the West, where all use plain speech, and being an Irishman also, I guess that affects it, we use language out there that can be understood. And when I heard many of my brethren, especially among the pure-hearted preachers, claiming that my language was offensive because I said bull in the pulpit, I hardly knew what to do. And so we see this culture clash more necessarily than clothed in theological terms or trying to look for theological terms, and really it's a culture clash. Some Texas preachers cast a plain-spoken tradition in terms of the proverbial Texas shootout and admonish one another to fire mighty salvos of shot and shell into the ranks of the enemy and put the foe to rout. Well, that is a loving, gracious attitude toward your brother, isn't it, and sister? Yet, they were perfectly comfortable with that understanding because that's all that they had known. That's what they had seen. That is what they had been taught. And we sitting on this side of it think, and we kind of laugh at it. And maybe we think back and remember that attitude and those practices, and maybe we were even part of them, of that approach. And yet now we might look at it and go, that seems a little bit out there. But nonetheless. And so these things impact. When the Texas preachers in the early 20th century fired their shot and shell, more often than not, they took aim at two targets: the fashionable disciples of Christ with the organs and missionary societies, or the competing denominations. Now remember, at this time, this is the late 1800s. Remember, the official breakup was 1906 because the census recognized it. So some historian looks to some point to look to and give credit for. Well, it was happening for years before that. And so it's that. And it's looked at that. And so, or the competing denominations. And we've all heard the sermons on the denominations and things such as that. One Texas preacher who routinely took aim as both was T.R. Burnett, who wrote 3 volumes of satirical poetry, published Carl Poetry. Carl written a lot of poetry. I don't know if you've written poetry like this, but I hope not. It was published in the Firm Foundation. A sample of Burnett's lyrical talent can be found in his rendition of "Alas, and Did My Savior Bleed," meaning to that tune, when he rewrote to satirize the Baptists. If you will, in the straw pen roll, that means roll around the barn, and wrestle hard, my boy, you get salvation in your soul, and shout and jump for joy. So kind of that revival, approach that we've talked about before is what he's kind of lambasting. At the bench where I first saw the light, and excitement took my senses all away. It was there in a straw that I wrestled all night, and now I'm deluded all day. And so, and it's kind of funny as you look at this, but in other words, it's also kind of sad. And so it's that rational, intellectual approach that as we've looked at extensively in our history, against that revivalist, more emotional, style that we've also looked at, and that's what he's lambasting. And of course, he's saying that's just, look how dim-witted they are that are that, and kind of it's either this or that. And so, such was the climate by and large among our churches in Texas. And again, I think if we looked at Baptist history, we'd probably find similar things. Would that be true, Ellen? Yes, and other groups. And so again, we are part of the larger thing and not just some unique little thing moving along. And so we're just looking at it from our perspective. It was a climate that supported the hardscrabble lifestyle of underprivileged settlers who had generally lived on the underside of society and knew little refinements of a more settled social order. It was this climate that sustained the sectarian model that was inherited from Campbell, Fanning, Franklin, and other of our 19th century forefathers. It was a climate in which Foye Wallace, who we've mentioned and we're going to go into more detail about, was born in Montague County, Texas in 1896. Thank you, Montague. I'm not good with French either. Or is that French? I don't know. Okay, Montague. Where is that about? So kind of that north central part of the state. Okay, and so that's where he comes from. And so this is the environment. This is that heritage that Wallace, and Wallace was going to become a very powerful, influential, and very controversial figure. In fact, when we were looking at McGarry last week, Gary Horn commented to me afterwards, he said McGarry was a moderate compared to Wallace. That was his comment. And so very forceful, and we're going to look into that. Perhaps more than any other person of the period, Foye Wallace Jr. embodied, and when we refer to him, we might not always throw the junior on, okay, so we're talking the same guy. Embodied all the qualities we discussed, from the hard style of theology that focused squarely on human initiative, and his theology is perhaps most clearly revealed in his sermons. And so he was what they called at the time a boy preacher. He was a guy from a young age that was doing it and going around. Carl Ketcherside was a boy preacher and went around as a 12-year-old and was preaching in places. And so, in other words, this concept may be unusual, but it wasn't, unique. In 1937, he published a small volume of sermons under the title "The Certified Gospel." Have any of us heard of that sermon? No, that was a very famous one, and one of the things that was often done in those days and for a long time was these preachers would publish their sermons in the book form or pamphlet form and sell them. That's because they aren't being paid enough. Probably part of it. And that's how a lot of them made their money. In the sermon bearing the title of the volume, Wallace explained his conception of the gospel. Though the sermon occupies 5 pages of print, he only divided 5 lines to the themes of the cross and the atonement. The cross declares God's infinite hatred of sin and God's infinite love of the sinner. Beyond that, he did not elaborate. And so an acknowledgement of those things. And again, we've been looking into that when we've been looking at the grace part, which we'll look at even more extensively later. It's an understanding. It's an emphasis as we try to understand why these things happen. The bulk of the sermon was given over 2 issues. The list of evils Wallace especially wanted to combat: evolution, modernism, denominationalism, and faith-only revivalism. Now, with the evolution of modernism, that was along with what we would call the fundamentalists, even though our people rejected, except maybe some, well, we're not fundamentalists, even though there was this overlap, and a discussion of the true church. Wallace claimed that the certified gospel is that of Christ and the church, not just any church, but the one church, considering the fact that Christ built one, died for one, purchased one, and is the head of but one. Deep down in your heart, what church do you yourself think you should belong to, friend? Now, how many of us growing up heard the one church sermons? Probably a lot. And of course, what was, there's a lot of assumptions behind that. In other words, one, well, it's a good thing we happen to be the one, and they're not. That's kind of the assumption that was behind it. Everybody else saw the same thing, and we saw that last year when we were looking into like the landmark Baptists and things that Campbell and the others were kind of dealing with, and things such as that, because they thought exactly the same thing. And so this supreme confidence that I read this and it seems so clear to me. Why isn't it clear to you? And we think, well, I read my Bible. Well, so do they. And so, but these things can happen. He then amplified his definition of the certified gospel to include the gospel of Christ and the church versus men and their movements. Okay, so the gospel now is expanding out into a broader definition. And how does one enter the church? Here, Wallace focused on the divine plan. And we've mentioned that, which entails faith to change the heart. And we would say, well, yes. Repentance to change the will, turn the other direction. And baptism to change the state or location, so to speak. We take the Acts 2:38 is a major verse that we use. And he says, friends, this is a certified gospel. Well, neither Wallace nor those who looked to him for leadership had much conception at all of the unmerited grace that we touched on previously. Little wonder then that when one of Wallace's writers preached in Cincinnati, F.L. Rowe complained that the man's 4 sermons were forceful but largely pugnacious. Now, of course, we know pugnacious means trying to pick a fight, basically, trying to pick a fight. If you think of at times sitting with family on various occasions, if you're of different persuasions, political persuasions, you know how that goes. Not always very well. But anyhow, Rowe asked him at the supper table to preach a sermon on the prodigal son. And he hesitated a minute when he said, Brother Rowe, I cannot do it. I have never studied the subject. And so just, we focus on what we focus on. And some focus on these things is more important. Others on other things is more important. And yet, when we say the whole counsel of God and all that, do we really? That's kind of hard. But nonetheless, in his campaign to save churches of Christ, as he'd known them as a boy, and to discredit those whose style he considered too soft, and to destroy R.H. Bull, the premillennial thinking, Wallace transformed the hard style he inherited from his Texas upbringing into a swashbuckling fighting style that he urged upon his followers. In the very first issue of the Bible Banner, so remember, he was editor of the Gospel Advocate for about 3 years or a few years. Then he kind of left there, I think, because the others that are working in the paper he was just a little bit too hard charging, so to speak, in their view, I think. And so he formed his own, one of his own papers. I think he did several over the years, called the Bible Banner, which existed a long time. And he complained that a general softness is pervading the church, firm faith and plain preaching, once universal and unanimous among those devoted to the ancient gospel, are now yielding to the persuasions of the plush-mouthed and velvet-tongued moderns. And so you see, and if you've ever had opportunity to read these publications, you can see it's filled with this kind of language, if you will. And so I keep going back to, because it stuck with me, some sermons that Shane did quite a while ago. Remember when he talked about, the categorize, how the devil wants to categorize and put people into these categories. Well, what is he doing? He's kind of demonizing those who think differently. Now, yes, I would say he's trying to. Pardon? What I'm talking about is how he's labeling everybody that's different and saying plush mouth, velvet tongue, da-da-da-da-da, as kind of a normal way of discourse. That's what I'm referring to. Sure. Okay. So that means he's right. Okay. Sure. Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. On certainly on some things, especially with the Pharisees. Especially with the Pharisees. Yeah, no, I would think that wouldn't be correct. So does that mean that his pugnacious is the same as Jesus' pugnacious? Sure, it did. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Sure, sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. Well, and that's often what was equated is that idea that you gotta call them out because it's different, rather than it's this style this way, this style that there, and so yeah, I mean it's challenging, and so it just trying to make us aware of what was going on. Now again, that doesn't mean everybody accepted that, and we're going to see in our next section that there were those that were resisting against this approach as being not effective, whereas others were holding on strongly, and there are those in our fellowship that hold to this day to this approach. And so just make us aware, because remember, what are we trying to do? We're trying to understand who we are, how we got to where we're at now, so we can try to figure out these complex times, and it helps by understanding the past and what's gone through, because a lot of times we're not aware of some of this, and so we think, oh, it was always this way, or it was only this way, or these were my experiences, assuming that's everybody's experiences, just like Joe pointed out a few weeks ago. You guys I forgot what we were talking on in particular, but you were saying, well, that isn't how our congregation was. Well, and that was probably so. Yet others were and experienced that, and so it's important we realize that. He blamed his decline, this softening, on not unexpectedly on the ballistic plight that had been the malignant growth in the body of Christ, and on the spirit of pacifism. And so that apocalyptic, more grace-centered, which Bull was, approach, taking the fight out of the church. And so we're not unfamiliar with this. Maybe some attended debates. It's not like they were by any means common, but did some of you all ever go to the debates? Okay, and because that was the way things were done often in those days. Pardon? Yeah, and they became less prominent, that approach. But certainly in the 40s and 50s, it was still very strong among many. But anyhow, he instead called for militant preaching and teaching and writing that defends the truth against all errors. Teachers of error and instructions of error by name, make, model, and number. He wanted them to call people out. Name names. Wanted to name names. And to give biblical sanction to his campaign, Wallace appealed to Paul, arguing he was as personal in preaching and in writing as any man ever was. And when he denounced heresy and heretics, our strongest language is mild beside his. And so I said, hey, wait a minute, Paul did that. He's a lot worse than I am. And so, just how we kind of justify, things and the way we do things. Now, you're fine. Yeah. If you're located. You have a building if you're located. Maybe some, but especially in Texas, you see those Texicans, right? Right, Christiana? We always joke about that. Yeah. Well, and there were those that pointed those things out. I remember Carl Ketcherside in his biography just said, this is so much more about personalities and people But just because there's churches and elderships doesn't mean that the churches and elderships don't think that way. So it's not it's not that these just old lone guys running around, so to speak. And again, everybody was not that way, but there was enough that we all know how churches of Christ were stereotyped with that understanding, whether it rightly or unrightly from where we were at, from where you're at, was being done. Because remember, what's a stereotype? A stereotype comes about because there's enough things that it's happened that way. The problem with a stereotype is it paints everybody with that, and that isn't necessarily the case, and isn't the case generally. And so Wallace's followers were not slow to get his message. They soon virtually filled the Bible banner with calls for militant preaching. And so that was the style. Many of these calls perpetrated the familiar lower-class bias that favored sectarian religion and reflected implicit awareness that the churches of Christ, even in the late 1930s, was moving more toward this denominational status. And by that, remember, we're referring to this broader acceptance within the culture and among other Christian groups is how we're referring to in other words, wanting to be, instead of just so separate, but being part of the larger whole is what that's referring to. And so there was an R.A. Turner who made the case in point. He condemned the window-dressed with piety, lily-fingered, please let us pray type of preacher pastors with the pensively sweet manners who serve as social secretaries of the congregation and make hop calls on women while the men are at work. He put such preachers in the class with the near-nude bathers, the wibble-wabble, dancing church members, cigarette-smoking, beer-drinking, card-playing men and women of the church, including preachers, adultery, and the movies hatched from the incubator of whoredom in Hollywood. And so he's almost stumbling over himself to make sure he gets everything in, into what he's saying. And I heard some messages that way, and that a person felt better if they could say the most of those. They felt like that was bold, Jerusalem wielding, the phrase earlier, preaching was how they could say that. And so that it was almost virtue signaling. I don't know. I'm not sure. I looked up enough to see who he was and get his birth date, but I didn't read his whole online, which is where I get there's a restoration history or something like that, and so for many, it'll give that and a little log and or a little explanation of them and where they're buried and things like that. And I find that extremely interesting because many of these are names that we haven't heard of, and maybe some of us have. Yeah. And I don't know if he was in Texas or not. He may have been. But this understanding, and maybe we've all, as in our life in the church, have heard phraseology like that, and it isn't just us. And so anyhow, but nonetheless, we're trying to understand what was going on. As others expressed alarm that the soft preachers had apparently joined ministerial alliances, A.B. Keenan complained that such alliances existed only for the stifling of religious investigation by the fostering of union meetings and pulpit exchanges, by extolling of a common heritage and by the willingness to let seekers salvation join the church of his choice. He went on to say that Unsullied Restoration Platform agrees as well with the membership in the pastors' union as God with the devil. In other words, what are these guys doing? What are they doing meeting with us who claim Jesus but aren't just us or all the things that we are? What are they doing? And so there was a mindset and an idea. Now that mindset isn't nearly what it once was. Now, some may look at that as because it's gone soft, and that's bad and awful. But there's also another side to that, which we will touch on as we go on. We will stop here with Hugo McCord. Has anyone heard that name before? No? We're learning about all kinds of people. All right, we're done and run out of time, so thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. Hugo.